So hello, Ivy. I am really, really excited to meet you. And I think, this conversation is really representative of what the Femme Future Society was designed to do. It's, we were meeting all these interesting women that were either on lists of top futurists or just work that they were doing that was sort of fascinating. We were having these back channel conversations and we thought, gosh, it's more fun if you can actually share them with other people and share this work with other people. And in doing so, by the way, also hopefully redress or do our very best to try and balance out a real imbalance that exists in women in frontier technology. So since you are, I would call you less of like the classic futurists that we sometimes speak with, but really technologists and economists, people who are actually building and shaping the future are futurists, right? You're in there making it happen. And so I know that we found each other on LinkedIn and we've been interested in each other's work. And so thanks for agreeing to have our initial conversation be in this format.
Amazing to be here. And likewise, I like what you said about the difference between sort of something that's in theory and something that's really true to our heart, and then how that's actually amplified or manifested in practice fields, right? So thank you for pointing out that a lot of times we all have this innate drive to want to do something. And a lot of times that calling is super strong. And I'm also very grateful for the fact that I'm able to kind of actually carry that out. Defaulting to action is not always as easy as it sounds.
Oh, absolutely not. One of my favorite quotes these days is from Amelia Earhart that says the biggest decision or the most profound decision is the decision to act. The rest is mere tenacity. And I think that that's actually a really, it's true. Once you decide that you're going to go for it, then you have to kind of follow through. But I do think the decision to act is a really hard one. And so take us a little bit through your journey then, because I don't know you, and I have done a little less research on you. I've done more on the product that we'll talk about than on your own story. So tell us, sort of the quick version of your story, how you got here.
Sure thing. Well, I will make it super short and hopefully immersive, and because I am a designer by trade, so a lot of times I feel like I have to compensate for the fact that we're not in the same room, right?
I know, true.
Yeah. So I am, for the most part, an ex-agency person. And lastly, prior to building Evermore, I was very much still part of that world with PricewaterhouseCoopers, actually, doing experience strategy and consultancy. And this is a fun story, actually. I was with great people, and these are, again, we're always building on the shoulders of giants, and it was very much that at PWs. And they gave us the latitude of coming up with what we wanted to call ourselves. Not so much sort of like the formal roles, but what we represent, right? And this kind of comes full circle on how do you bridge what's true to your heart, your passions, to your practice fields. And I remember we had just moved into this new office on Madison Avenue, overlooking Bryant Park, gorgeous space, very thoughtfully designed. So we were printing out these huge plaques that would be like basically laminated heads of us, right? Headshots with a little blurb of us. I actually put the word, you're like this, I put the word futurist as part of my tagline. And I'm pretty sure at the time everybody's just like, we don't know what that is, but Ivy's fun. So the design experience background that I had was, for the most part, let's just say I was able to stay true to that course. And over sort of like the natural evolution of the fields, right? Design, communications, arts, and user experience.
I'm going to back up for 1 second, because it said that you went to Pratt in architecture. So did you study architecture?
Yes, I did. Oh my God, we're going way back.
Well,
yes,
I think that the stories, because we were talking about this with someone earlier today about these stepping stones, right? And so the original curiosity is architecture, which then led you to something that's then led you to PricewaterhouseCoopers doing transformation strategy stuff, or I forgot exactly what you were doing at PwC.
Yeah, all of those words. But architecture definitely was sort of calling out and teasing out the parts of me, in essence, that really care about how we design our environment, right? Aesthetics, form. Sometimes we don't think about this, but structure really defines our behaviors, right? Like just think of the last time, I mean, not so much these days anymore, but the last time you walked into an amazing space, maybe a cathedral or like some kind of enormous, expansive space, how that changed how you felt. So architecture was that first calling for me. Everything else sort of was this just beautiful unfoldment of, okay, I care about aesthetics. I care about the qualities that we experience day in, day out. And it wasn't really that big of a leap going from like the physical space to sort of the mental space and the interactive space that's digital.
Isn't that fascinating? Because I will say that, we've done maybe 15 of these interviews so far, I'm trying to remember, and a significant number of y'all studied architecture. It's a
Wow.
really interesting, kind of like data point. We have enough data yet to fully look at that, but I would say that in terms of like undergraduate degrees, or even like postgrad, but architecture has been an interesting theme that goes through this. So there must be something about the structural here, right, and the way that things are put together, and to your point, the creative design of it, that sort of then continues to foster all this other creativity, and I think gives you guys a really interesting grounding in terms of, no pun intended, in how to frame these things and how to build these things. So I just find these leaps are interesting, and again, I think what's fascinating for any young people who hear these conversations is to realize that you can start here and go here and go here, which I think is so cool, right? It's really very curiosity led. So then you went from PwC and you did this work as a transformationist / futurist / I think it's actually really cool. By the way, let's just stop for a second and say that they let you define your roles. I think it's a really hugely important thing when we talk about the future of working and how we adapt and become more responsive to the needs of the future. And so I love not being locked into titles and sort of traditional roles. I've always been a big advocate for that.
Right.
So it's cool that PwC is also on that train. How long were you there?
I was there a little over a year. So well, sometimes we think we're unplugging from the matrix, and we're really just unplugging from one and plugging to the other. So last September, I left PwC to join an accelerator program. And that's kind of like the next chapter of my journey got started, right? I was like, well, there are these domains that I'm really naturally interested in. I'm never going to see it as work. Things are like, aesthetics, design, psychology, neuroscience. It just really gets nerdier and nerdier as
I love it.
I progressed. And I, so to speak, is unplugging from the matrix of having a career / a job to now building ever more, which is again still very true to my nature, which is technology and design, but with a huge splash of psychology in what I'm building right now. So
where did the technology part come in? Because again, I understand sort of the architecture, I understand getting to PwC and understanding again those structures and systems, but where did the tech side and the interest in neuroscience and it's, because that's a big, I mean, you're jumping into the world of artificial intelligence. We'll talk in a moment about what you're building with Evermore. If you want to just give a descriptor now so we don't leave people hanging. What is Ever? How do you describe it?
Yes, no cliffhangers here. Evermore is a health platform that essentially gamifies psychology. So then in sort of this day and age of us completely bombarded by the attention economy, young people especially can now have fun going inwards and figure themselves out, safe, creative, self-discovery, and then come back outside to the world when they're feeling like they're empowered enough to engage.
Well, yeah, and I thought of it as less of that they're sort of retreating into this place, and it just becomes a really, I don't know how to word, but lack of a better word, scientific way of being able to really reflect and learn more about yourself, right? You're using all these tools together and sort of structures together to be able to give people more insight into themselves, specifically focused on young people. And for those who want to look it up, it's Evermore without the extra E. So it's EVR, right?
Yep.
MORE. But when you Google it, like a weird other stuff comes up. What was the domain? It's evermore.com.
Evermore.io.
.io. That's right. Okay, so it's a little tricky when you look it up. We'll go back to that in a moment. But so you have this background that started here. That where does the tech side come in and the confidence to build with an artificial intelligence solution?
A huge flashback to the 90s, maybe even, I mean, not earlier. But the design background essentially put me square in the space of what used to be called webmasters, right?
Right. Okay.
So at that time, before we had all of these sort of code lists, you don't have to learn how to code to now really build a whole startup from scratch. Forget about just a website. Back then, you kind of needed some background in coding, some technical expertise to kind of finesse your way in the myriads of how tech was unfolding on the internet. So that's when tech first came in. And I won't even get into how physical I got with that, because I did at one point also was a system integrator. So I was jamming memory cards onto motherboards and putting them into computers.
Well done. It all is magic to me, man. I don't know how a computer works. I don't know how a plane flies. Like, it's amazing how much I don't know about how things work, which is kind of sad. Someone actually gave me for my birthday once a book about how computers work, thinking it was a big gift for me. And I'm like, I don't want to know.
I don't need to know this.
Well, he was really concerned that I didn't know. And he felt like it was a real lack of my intellectual literacy that I had no clue about how computers really work, which is true, and I sort of barely understand algorithms. But okay, so now flash to so you go over to PwC, you've got this idea that you think needs to exist on the planet, and you apply to the incubator, and you're part of that for the last portion of 2019, right?
Right.
And is that where the idea really got more refined, and you are really taking the world?
Yeah, for sure. I think again, it's that essence, that throbbing core that exists within you. That's always kind of like, hello, you're probably not doing still the right thing. So it's getting recalibrated every time and becoming truer and truer to my nature, let's say. There is a interesting side narrative to this whole unplugging from the matrix. Is about 7 to 8 years ago, I came across a very highly esteemed Western trained scholars who were essentially fusing the science of the mind, the brain, and the body into one at the Tibet House in New York. So it kind of got woven into this, okay, if I was already kind of a nerd about how technology is effectively changing our behaviors every day, I need to now go behind the scenes and really now plug into the matrix of how everything comes together. So I was very privileged to come into the realm of these teachers who were really life-affirming work that they were presenting in ways that Westerners can understand, but also appreciating and completely honoring the wisdom traditions that comes from the East.
What is your actual background? Where were you born, and where are you now?
I am in the financial district in New York, and I have been a New Yorker ever since I want to say age 9. I was born in Taiwan. Yeah.
So just, I'm going to ask that because there was this interesting, East-West
Right.
Perspective, and I think the more global. Again, one of the things that's been really interesting about the collection of women that we've had these conversations with is how global everyone's both lives and work are. I feel, interestingly parochial, which I never really realized I was until I hang out with all of y'all. But I think it's also interesting. So there was a little departure too that I was reading about, because I'm actually really interested in this as well. Was the co-living place that were you in New York? Was it Origin House? Is that what it's called? Or the
Art? It was called Origin. Yeah.
And you just want to give us like a little, I don't know how much you want to share that, but I just find that it's also a really interesting, I don't know what to call it, structure, form, way of connecting and learning and living that I think is still really nascent for most people outside of really big cities, but I think is a really fascinating peek into the future.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. That's also, in a way, a fascinating thing for me to think about, because if we were just talking about the physical structures of what contains us, right? A living space is definitely that. What gets really kind of interesting is then you kind of put strangers together, albeit curated, very thoughtfully curated strangers together, which, by the way, is sort of almost inevitable, especially in bigger cities. You know, the rising cost of living going up, like eventually you just kind of have to make spaces count. So that complexity of getting strangers together, making sense of each other's definition of what a home is.
So how many people were in this home?
About seven
Okay, so seven
people.
people, 7 bedrooms.
Yep, yep, in a brownstone. So beautiful space. You know, again, that's the architecture side speaking. Beautiful space. So in terms of creating a harmonious and comfortable living space, it's all there. Now, this is where I'm going back to psychology, right? Is you can never really expect how people will behave if they have to see each other day in and day out. And everybody came from, speaking of diverse backgrounds, everybody came from different parts of the world, different walks of life. That is sort of the ultimate game in like figuring out complexity, as I was also living in it myself.
Right.
So hands first-hand experience of how, you know, the interesting segues, again, real estate, how we're designing spaces, how we're living in them, that's always evolving. I'm no longer associated with that business, but that really taught me a lot in terms of, you know, home is really sacred. We don't usually think about it, and we oftentimes take these things for granted, right? But especially when you have New York City, huge confluence of different kinds of people. It's a lot more than a business in that sense, because you're effectively shifting behaviors and really leaving behind a lot of traces of what people think will be, wow, this completely changed my life. And these are people that will always know and speak to, depending on how they're absorbing all these shifts in.
I do think that there's this question there about intentional community and intentional co-living, right? I had studied co-working a zillion years ago, and not even studied, like just sort of came upon it and thought, oh my gosh, this will be the future, right? It was a practice of writers back in the day to give each other confidence in a creative domain, but we knew it was going to catch on as the world of work shifted, and all of a sudden, WeWork became the big global brand. I have those same feelings about this idea of co-living and intentional living in different forms, not necessarily always in one house. It could be on a bigger compound, whatever. Do you sense that as you look to the future? Because again, when we go back to Evermore and the problem that it's trying to solve for, right, which is that people feel well held on the planet, they understand themselves, a greater sense of self-awareness, they're able to connect with others with more confidence, all that kind of stuff. Like there's a big weave, in your work and what it is that you do. But I do just, divergently for a second, thinking about this idea of community and intentional design around that. Do you think that that will continue to grow?
Yeah, I think it needs to, just because the world is only ever getting more and more complex. And it's obviously also going at a speed that it's exponential. And if we just think about mapping that back to where our neurons aren't getting, we're not getting any more of them. So this kind of, the complexity theory, that's very much something that's, inherent in everything we do, how we behave around others. That really requires, I feel like, a way for people to be taught how to live harmoniously again. I do also feel like, obviously the craziness that is 2020, that kind of just bumped that all up to a whole magnitude. So a lot of people are going through a lot of changes, and living space changes is probably on top of the list, right? Everybody's kind of moving about, trying to create a new sense of safety. I feel like and that's why, with the evolution of people who are experts in how to design intelligent spaces, cities, societies, we kind of have to start looking at all of these things, from a systemic standpoint. So systems thinking in creating how we live, how we behave needs to be a much bigger topic than I think it has ever been.
So with all of this amazing, curiosity and brain power and perspective, Ivy, you decided to go create this thing. So why this and why now? Why Evermore now?
It's again, the quick answer is for me personally, that's just the natural next step. I can't not do that at this point, right?
What was the awareness of, like, I do want to, like, I'm curious about the genesis of it, like when you knew that this was it and this was the form that it should take. Like, I always start from what is the problem I'm trying to solve for? What is either the frustration or the fear or the opportunity that I see? Like, where was it that it sort of came together for you that you thought there needs to be this platform? And then again, we'll go into a minute about how the platform works and where it is in its development, but like what this thing is and why, what is it you're trying to solve for in this way?
Right. So remember, I had basically my entire career at the front row seats of watching how technology is changing our behaviors every day. I'm sure maybe some of the audience, and maybe you, watch The Social Dilemma. It's very much a reality. How it all kind of came to a head for me, and I think again, it's always in the back of my mind. I think energetically and also from a practical standpoint, it was already shaping. So the sort of the eventual leaving job, entering accelerator kind of just brought it to a place where it can actually become real. So having front row seats, watching how technology is effectively changing, not just us. And I think like when you add these quick, rapidly changing worlds, and you kind of put young minds in the center of all of that, well, that's without mercy. I feel like the one time we really have to stop ourselves and say, wait a second, like we should start thinking about these other things, right? Which I
start thinking. So let me just back up. The Social Dilemma is a documentary on Netflix that talks about the formation of the social media world that includes Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, Reddit, et cetera, and the early founders who were building this quote unquote first just because they could, right? And weren't quite sure what it was going to be and how big it was going to grow. But then at some point had to figure out how to commercialize this and built some really toxic, horribly corrosive business models around it. And then we're like, oopsie, like wish we hadn't done that, which is super frustrating to watch, right?
Yeah.
And then they continue to do it. Like even once they figured out what they were doing, they continued to be feeding the corporate Wall Street machine and continue to do it in a way that is really dangerous, like really, really dangerous. So
yeah. So well, kind of going back to, I mean that's a much larger thing for one person or a whole sector to tackle. Again, going back up to the systems level. And again, I feel like what's the saying? Like the path to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So like the on the show mentioned, everybody was like, no one individual actually had any harmful intentions as they were creating this, but it kind of just unfolded this way. So with Evermore, I had the privilege of and the years of toiling and working in industries where I was basically understanding firsthand how every knob and dial and click, how that was culminating in people's behaviors being changed one micro moment at a time, which actually adds up to be an entire lifetime of interactions that might or might not be beneficial. And then going back to my Tibetan scholar teachers who were really infusing in me a lot of how, while there's a lot of precious lives being wasted in this sense, right? So it all came to a front to where I decided that, it's kind of ironic. You kind of have to create an app that's like an anti-app app, or you're using more technology to to kind of fight the pathologies of technologies that have brought us to where we are today, which is completely fine, right? Because it's all about what is the human value that I'm trying to present at the end of the day. So Evermore, for the most part, like I was mentioning, is really a tool. And I'll just be really concise about this. It's a platform because we do have multiple markets, but for the most part, if we just start thinking about the social narratives that we're all kind of very much entrenched in these days, every social media platform has an inherent narrative. On Twitter, we behave a certain way. On Facebook, on LinkedIn, we do have that what Social Dilemma showed as an avatar that's kind of floating in the background that we use to project ourselves into the world. Evermore is turning all that on its head. It wants to welcome young people to come into a space where before they are any gender, any race, in any age group, they are themselves, they should start to learn to be a product of their own actions, right? That's prior to any kind of platform narrative or social agenda. So it's a smart journal that young people talk to as a sounding board that really what's doing on the back end is obviously through tapping on the power of articulation, which has been completely relegated, right? We're all doing this these days. The human voice, they can start to actually really activate that again, but this time not with an audience, right? They're talking to themselves. They're talking to themselves in a way that is, again, so they're able to kind of unfold without any competing agendas and narratives. And it's done so in a very practical, repeatable, and sociable way. There are aspects, social aspects, where they can also start to share their inner thoughts with others, but they first have to do that with themselves.
But it's not just that it's a voice recording device where I get to just like have an opportunity to record my thoughts, and I don't know, I'm sure there are prompts that help me get to some of those things and I get to deeper understanding of things, but you have brought a whole level of what you describe as empathy AI or digital psychology. So let's break those things apart in terms of what Evermore actually does and how it does it.
Sure. So the digital psychology really just speaks to how there's a whole other layer of how our psychology is unfolding in the digital world. It's just happening.
Term. I hadn't heard that before I read your bio, and I thought that was an interesting way of describing it.
Thank you. Thanks. And I feel like a lot of times you hear certain words over and over until it becomes cliche, but just because they're cliches actually means that they're true. We just have to kind of connect with it we have to have a different relationship with it. So understanding that digital psychology of how we're really changing so rapidly that before we consciously we're aware of what's happening in our worlds, a lot of that is encapsulated in our clicks, in our typing, self-editing, and all that. We really inherently, that's very human. We all want to be perceived well, so then we can get the social proof and the validation, right? Because we're a collective. We're a collective species. The digital psychology plays that into the whole narrative-driven experience, which then gets into the empathy. A lot of times, machine learning has, not a lot of times, well, let's just say all the time, right? There are certain metrics that drive the engine, that drives the algorithms. Empathy AI at its core, it's not really trying to pay off on engagement, right? Or happiness, because those are very hard to define terms. Empathy AI, what it brings to the experience to make sure that because it is a voice technology, you're talking to it, you're talking about your dreams, visions, maybe your darkest secrets, right? It really puts you in a very vulnerable space. what can technology do at that moment of vulnerability to actually make you also have the space of zero judgment zone to rant, but grow, right? It's to just be a really good listener. And that's where empathy AI comes in. We don't just, in the app, we don't just care about the words that are being spoken, we care about how it's said, right? The majority of our human communication is actually nonverbal. So the voice doesn't lie. Nancy's tone of excitement is going to be different than Ivy's tone of excitement. But if the app can actually create that baseline and start to see these kind of peaks and valleys, that's how it's empathetically connecting to the users in a way that can help them better understand themselves. But also, I feel like this is a really key aspect of the app is you start to kind of have a continuum of the self, right? A lot of times what we do online is completely fractured. Like if you just go into your feed, your LinkedIn feed, that speaks to the professional side of you, right? On Facebook, that's the social. On Twitter, something else. Evermore is a place where that is actually how your inner psyche is unfolding. That's your entire life captured.
I do love that it turns it in, but let me say, so it gives me a place, that's what I guess where I'm still kind of pushed in the understanding of this idea. It's like, it gives me a place to express that and have a place to capture it. And I do think that voice is different than typing and it gives you a whole different thing. But the empathy AI part is that it somehow then is giving me either feedback on that or it's shaping the questions that it asks me as a result. Like there's a dynamic in terms of what it is that I'm saying, and then it sort of responds back to me. Do I know that there's an entity there that's somehow speaking back? Like I don't understand fully how it works yet. So.
Yeah. I think this is a common question that sometimes I either answer directly or indirectly. And this is actually very interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. It's a lot of times we feel like if the technology has some kind of dynamism, such as machine learning or AI, it means that it has to be super responsive, right? Because we are conditioned to think that every time, especially if the technology is working right, it's just always at the ready to provide a prompt, to be like, yes, you're sad, yes, you're happy, or this is how you go about your business, or this is how you can have a more rewarding life. But then we forget that fast is not always right? So how Evermore provides that continuing incubation for the person is it will listen to your conversations, the recordings, which we're calling time capsules in the app. It will contain all of that. It does the analysis on the back end. It's not going to rush to validate your emotions. That's for you to own. And I feel like a lot of times what these social platforms are doing is when you jump at the gun to kind of provide validation, you're sometimes hijacking that person's narrative, right? Because you're beating them to it. And if we just kind of go back to, well, Evermore, it's a smart journal. So the act of journaling is just so you can kind of sort out your thoughts, right? So it will allow you that spaciousness to sort out your thoughts. But what it will also do is it will start to show you emergences of, guess what?
It does. So the kind of feedback in
right.
some form. Okay.
Yes, there will be, it will start to show you your thought patterns and emergences where, guess what? For the past week, you talked about Nancy a handful of times. Every time you talked about Nancy, your voice is joyful, right? And all the other interactions. There are also a lot of developmental modules that we're creating. We're calling them visions and quests, right? Again, there's a lot of game theory under the hood, but essentially what they do is they bring out new discoveries. You're like, oh, well, I didn't actually see that I enjoyed Nancy's company this much, right? These interactions are actually nourishing me instead of depleting me. And these are wonderful patterns to show people how they can develop and form much deeper connections and relationships than these transient transactions and clicks and likes that we see
So,
everywhere.
it's just so fascinating. There's work that's being done in lots of different areas. So at the University of Texas last year, I was just looking at a project that students had done, and they were really interested in mental health in South Korea for some reason. Somebody had an exchange student, talked about how much pressure she was always under, and so felt like they wanted to figure out a way to help solve this problem in South Korea, and they sent a team of students over. It was really a design project, right? It would go right to your design and tech sensibilities. And what they found is that no one talks about mental health in that environment or in that community. It's sort of an inherent part of having to, I'm really dumbing it down. It was much smarter and much more insightful than I'm making it sound, but in the simplest form, right? One of the insights was that mental health isn't something that is actively discussed and promoted and nurtured there. And certainly not support around it. And so they built this interesting ad. They did it as an app. And I think it was one of those things where you rated conversations and sort of what your mood was with various people. And the idea is that you would get this feedback back exactly as you just said. Every time you spend time with Ivy, you come back really enthused. And every time you spend time with whoever, right, you feel drained and depleted. And so it's just sort of a feedback mechanism in its crudest form, not nearly as sophisticated as what you're building, but there's a sort of innate desire to be providing this. And even students kind of felt a need for that. So that's why I think where you're plugging into something that is actually very, people are sensing that they want more responsiveness to. Then I go the other side of it. My buddy Steve Brown, who was a futurist with Intel and now is out in the world, as he calls it, the bald futurist, got in a debate once about sensors and technology. And I was like, you know what? I don't need everything to be smart. Like, you can't make my pillow any smarter than it is. He's like, wow. And all of a sudden we started imagining together, what if there was a sensor that was in my pillow and it read my dreams at night, and then in the morning it would give me kind of an analysis and gave me a sense of like what was going on for me. Like, you're really stressed out about this, or you're feeling really empowered about that. Or I'm like, oh my God, I do want a smart pillow. Like, that would be amazing, right? And then the third version of that is what SOAR is trying to do. I don't know if you know anything about what Paul Allen's trying to do with SOAR and create this kind of like AI guide / consultant in your life that takes all the StrengthsFinder stuff from Gallup and somehow matches it up to tell you who you are and to be your AI coach. So there's this interesting kind of like desire to have technology somehow help us understand ourselves better.
Yeah.
And so I guess I would argue that we're really early days, right? These are sort of experiments in this direction. So in terms of, as you are, I guess, either inspired by, is there something out there that you're really inspired by, or that you think that you want to, like, that you can imagine where this could go? Like, I guess I think about this. This is still in beta, right? Has this even launched yet?
Not yet. We're scheduled to launch at the end of the year.
Okay.
At the same time, there's a reason we're taking a little longer. We're working at the time, and this is again responding to what's happening right now. We realize that obviously, without even thinking about business models, we realize that how kids are kind of really coping right now, as educators are as well, and they have been doing tremendously by keeping things still going, moving ahead. What's really happening is, if there's basically despair and shifts of change compounded by all of what's happening right now. Their kids already kind of going through the transitions of, okay, I'm coming out of middle school to going to high school now, high school to college to becoming a real adult and having a career. Now you're doing a meta transitioning of also trying to make sure that you're doing that in a way that's not compromised, right? So all the work that we have been doing has caught a lot of attention by educators. So we're currently collaborating with a lot of schools to think about, okay, this is something that, as you were saying, Nancy, is this the type of social technology that they want? And we obviously have checked off that box with, like, yes, there's a desire to have a space for reflection before you start socializing. And also, simultaneously at the same time, depending on what you feel like it's safe sharing. So
Right.
This could eventually, and we're building it to be this way, of picking up where student cohort relationships have suffered, because now they can't really interact with each other outside of their Zoom classes, right? So there are a multitude of use cases to be explored there. So, and the short answer is we are launching at the end of the year. But along with that is obviously also the social emotional analytics that educators and wellness practitioners can use to have better psychological insight of the young adults they're caring for?
Individually, like by name or in aggregate?
Anonymous.
Okay, good. I was going to say, I think that's well, I was going to say, so again, I'm just going to keep layering what sort of, I'm using my own mental model to try and understand this one. So forgive me if my stuff is outdated, but again, at the University of Texas, Jamie Pennebaker, who's head of the Department of Psychology, I'm not sure if he still is, is famous for two things, right? One is about the importance of journaling and being able to work through your emotions and work through challenging moments, and sort of like the father of this idea as a therapy. And then several years ago, I wrote a book about the secret life of pronouns. And what pronouns, like our usage of pronouns, says about ourselves, which when you go to write him an email, by the way, it just completely freaks you out, because you're like, look at how many times you said I and whether or not you said you enough. And, you get yourself all worked up over it. But he has been working with Microsoft Research and another guy named Eric Horvitz years ago. And I haven't caught up with their research in the last few years, but it was all about language and how we query things and how we express ourselves. And it was like, again, at the very beginning of this work that I'm assuming that you're advancing. So that work that we're seeing is like, it is powerful, right? In terms of being able to layer on all this understanding, but it also holds a tremendous amount of responsibility, right? You in some ways are giving me feedback based on whatever the algorithmic, choices are that were being made there. And, so I guess there's a part of me that's like, on the one hand, I want my daughter to be able to experience this. And on the other hand, I'm like, God, I just want to make sure that she's being held in it. You know what I mean? This is powerful. It's not like just taking a quiz online that says you're this kind of, this and that, or what your horoscope says. I mean, I've got a 17-year-old daughter who spends a lot of time doing those quizzes, right? Because she's trying to figure herself out.
Right.
Understand who she is in this world. And there's a social aspect to sharing that with each other. But there's a big responsibility that comes with this tender age and what it is that you are feeding back. So what is your kind of code of, ethics or values that you guys are framing this through?
Yes. So we're currently contending a lot of these big, we need to pay attention to these things, right? So one thing is, and I won't go into too much depth about AI governance and ethics, because that's definitely forehead deep in that every day, all day, every day. But as you're saying, these kind of, it is mental health. Whether or not the mental health product that you're building is considered a digital therapeutic or not, you are handling sensitive information. And there's definitely, before we can call it any kind of fancy words like ethics, governance, you as a human, you do feel like, wow, I am, with great power comes great responsibility. There's a moral obligation. So right now we're currently working with a lot of advisories in that space to make sure that where in the experience is there a drop-off point or a conjuncture where crisis management might be needed, right?
For sure.
Because we are listening to whatever and anything can be said in this time as you're talking to Evermore. So that's to say that space is defined enough for us to always be working towards as we kind of cross off stuff on our product roadmap, making sure that there's really not that that is addressed and there's accountability in place for those times where those situations need to be handled. But at the same time, going back to, there hasn't ever been a time where you're writing down on your journal and your journal speaks back to you. And Evermore, just so we're clear, we know that voice technologies, voice AI anyway, cannot really carry on completely natural, organic, like human conversations. So Evermore is not going to ever speak back to you yet. But like what we're saying, as it's getting you to really better understand yourself and make these fun self-discoveries and making sure that, you know what, your perspectives are unique to yourself and you're really kind of regaining the power to be your own person before any other technologies or narratives hijack that. Or we're making sure that it's done in a way that is with a lot of oversight from psychological frameworks, crisis management responses, to make sure that systemically we have it all figured out. But I also want to give the caveat that you can never really have it all figured out. I think that's where
I'm
we
about to
kind
say the same thing.
that's when we kind of get into the pitfall of like, oh yeah, I mean it's in that feature set right there, or like it's in that user story, uh, which is why I think, you know, we have to constantly be having dialogues like this and conversations about it.
Well, yeah, no, because I think again, it's a really powerful, like, as it evolves, it's a very, very powerful tool. Because again, one of the things that came up ethically with Jamie Pennebaker's work was if, I query some, like basically my search history or the way that I'm looking at online shows patterns for either depression or even for admittance to the hospital for fatal heart disease. Like they were able to find, like, depending on what the questions you asked and when you asked it, like could predict within months in advance whether or not you'd be admitted to the hospital for some like really significant thing. And it's like, oh my God, the fact that the AI would know that before I even know that, right? So then what is the responsibility back? Do I give a different query to Ivy than I give to Nancy, even though we're asking the same thing, but based on our pattern of responses, right? I need to be framed differently. Do I tell my insurance company? Do I, somehow actively tell you, hey, by the way, knock on the door, just so you know, the pattern shows that if, you're in danger of blah, blah, blah. Is a really, really fascinating question. And I do think the crisis side of it, I'm sure you know Nancy Lubline's work and crisis text hotline and all the things that they've learned in their data sets. And there was a piece that was written last year by David Brooks that I thought was really fascinating, that taking all that data that children had texted in and crunching it all the way, is that they found things like you were more likely to, the use of the word ibuprofen or pain management, things like ibuprofen and Advil, was significantly higher correlated with potential suicide than actually using the word suicide, right? Or certain emojis that were used a lot were more highly correlated. So just things that we will learn that nobody even knows is even remotely connected or doesn't believe that they are, like, or I just am saying there's just a significant amount of responsibility, I guess, that I am imagining that you guys are managing back in terms of helping people. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is where that line gets crossed. I mean, you can go all the way from just like giving me a prompt back that says, oh, tell me more. Or, oh, that's an interesting question to make you think about blah, blah, blah. Like it can just be sort of a coach, right? All the way to something that gives me very specific feedback back about what I'm going through, and, or to your point, points me to resources that I might need as a result of yada, whether it's another book I would need, or a counselor I would need, or a video I need to go watch.
Yeah, for sure. And this is obviously a question that we're asking ourselves every day as we're kind of building more feature sets. And I have to say that it will be responsible for me to have a very clear, succinct answer of where the line is actually crossed, right? Because that line is it's a gradient, and that line is going to be different for everybody. Where that's something that we have to start picking up to make sure that there's connectivity to crisis management is where, and you can find this in a lot of literature and also in terms of use and privacy and governance of a lot of mental health apps, is they look at, for exactly what you were saying, patterns of how words are being used, certain language pronouns, right, is an indicator or a precursor to something that could lead to self-harm, or when is suicidal ideation a process, and when is suicidal ideation something we should watch out for, because it's not so black and white. So I think by having these conversations, there's also always concurrent research. We're pulling in a lot of mental health research and how technologies mediate all of that.
Cut you off, but I think that this is the gift of machine learning / AI / whatever, which is that we were going to challenge a lot of assumptions that are in that literature, right? That literature, I think, was based on a certain level of understanding and a certain level of pattern recognition based up until a certain moment in time. And I think they're going to be privileged with a significant amount of insight with what it is that you do now, but how you build the path to that insight is a big part of the magic and responsibility of what it is.
Yeah. And also the other side of the flip side of that coin, when, like, going back to what I was saying, when technology becomes so responsive, it's kind of beating you to what you're about to do or what you're about to say, and in a way hijacks what the life or the interaction with the user, right? While there's definitely something to be said about how can we not further stigmatize mental health, right? A lot of times mental health technologies tend to want to get to a diagnosis, because the user on the other end of the screen or on the other side of the screen wants to know. We're always looking for answers. And sometimes the diagnosis is the place of comfort. We're like, oh, okay, so I am depressed, feeling blank, anything, right? But I also want to kind of, again, with that paradigm shift of how do we get the responsiveness to not be so condemning at the same time, right? With an eye towards, yes, we want you to get well, but you're also not broken or sick, or in any sense not recoverable or hopeless.
Yeah, there was a friend of mine who once, and literally this is like in my 40s, she gave me this advice when I was like getting all overwrought about something. She goes, a feeling is just a fart, like you just have them. And I was like, ah! And I'm like, kind of crude, but true. Like she just gave me permission to just feel it and not have to analyze it and worry that it's going to lead to 17 other things and whatever. And like it took me a long time just to get to that level of insight. Right. So imagine what is possible. Like, I think what's so fascinating about what you're building, the potential of it is that it gives, I worry so much about, you've seen my post, this is sort of how we connected, right? That I worry so much about the mental well-being and emotional well-being right now of youth, and the amount of both, potential that that they get to have in terms of rebuilding all kinds of things, and the responsibility that they hold, and the lack of resilience that we may have baked into them for this moment. So there's a lot that's going on for them right now. And I worry that a society in which, at least in the United States, a quarter of people 18 to 24 are now considering suicide is not a healthy society in any way, shape, or form. And it wasn't prior to this, and it's only getting worse. So I really feel like this is a huge area of development, but I also think that it is an area where the flip side of it is, I guess, this question about, could kids become over-reliant on it? Like in some ways you go to this now and this becomes kind of my outlet, right? And the way that it helps me make sense of the world and make sense of myself. Do I in some ways become overly dependent on that? Is that in any way a fear, or is that just a weird projection?
I feel like, again, the idea of something that's habit forming eventually becomes addictive. There's also obviously a gradient of like, if it's helping.
Right, I was gonna say it's a healthy addiction, right?
Then it's helping. Obviously your usage and the relationship that you're forming with your technology. And I think, just kind of, sometimes we like to have an easy answer, like whether it being a diagnosis or that technology is bad or that technology is good. It loses the sort of the all-encompassing power and potency of something, right? And I think that sometimes comes with like, we always need to be better educated, because we can always be less wrong or more right. And I feel like, again, yes, if you start to develop a super crazy dangerous addiction to talking to yourself.
It's not about the talking to yourself part. I do think it's the feedback part, and this is how you manage the feedback part. Because to your point, I don't think that and there are people who become self-obsessed, right, or overly neurotic about ruminating on things, which probably isn't. Right. But I do think it's the feedback piece of it that I think is an interesting balance between where it gives you insight. I mean, again, part of the reason I think about this is with my 17-year-old daughter. We were recently at an event, socially distanced, but not very many people there. But there was a new person that we met for the first time in 6 months. And he happened to be an astrologer, and he was really deeply interested in astrology. And so Harper started asking about her birthday and whatever. And he was giving her very specific advice about who she is based on this moment in time. And I kind of was like, hold up, right? She's really impressionable right now. Like, is this like, do I really want her to believe that she is this and she is that, as opposed to these are tendencies, or these are things to be curious about, or these are things to pay attention to? Like, it was framed so rigidly, right? So like for real. And I just felt like, at 17, that's not like you, because then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You start carrying that as who you are. And I felt like I just wanted it to be more fluid and for her to be evolving into that. And at the same time, knowing that you do have this sort of tendency, or that this is a way in which you might, manage the world differently than, 23andMe, we've done the the ancestry side, not the health side. Right. And it's fascinating to see, again, you're more likely to, have a lack of sense of direction, right? Or more likely to be, like, it really has like sort of like ways of being baked into the DNA profile. And so I guess I'm just rambling to say there is a tremendous amount that is going to, again, we're so early in, but I think
Yeah.
there's a fascination wanting to understand ourselves. There's a fascination that the technology might understand it better than we do. And so then we ascribe greater authority to it, right?
Yeah.
And if you read a book and it's like, okay, well, that's one person's philosophy and there's another person's philosophy, and I can decide for me which one works. When it actually becomes something like this, where I do think that we start to give greater authority to this thing, like they did in Her, right? You think that the AI knows you better than you know you.
Or maybe the AI knows you good enough to know when you need to be presented with an opportunity to reframe your own emotions, right?
Yeah, right. That's fascinating. Like that's super cool to me. I love that idea. And I've actually thought a lot about, that's why digital psychology caught my eye. So I do think that there will be a digital component to the actual therapeutic delivery of psychology and psychological insight. This is, I don't know where you want to classify this on that range, but in the same way that we are democratizing so many other things, I do think that there will be, at the basic level, a way in which people who can't afford any access to mental health services would at least have some bot that would be able to help them in a really positive way. Just to your point, just if nothing else, just being a listener and being a reflector and giving me space to think through that stuff, right? So I think the work that you are doing is a really powerful portion of the frontier. And I love to think that it's being created by someone who cares so much, right, about people and around the responsibility and the opportunity of this. There is an interesting question around the business model side of it. And we don't need to go into all those details now. I'm sure you're still working through all that. But do you think it's possible to create such a caring products, service, technology, platform, entity, and still make it so that it makes money, right? Those things can coexist.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of needs to be that, or else I am being irresponsible. As the time commitment and energy that I'm putting into building this thing, I obviously want everybody to thrive because of it. Not from a business perspective, but to the point of when you look at a tangible product or business entity, you kind of have to have a set of metrics that you assess it by, right? Like what deems it beneficial. And I sometimes I do think that language is very important. Going back to what we were saying, like a lot of times there are a lot of telltale signs in what we tell ourselves even. So I started always saying the word benefit instead of success.
Good, that's great.
Because success is kind of a little too, I feel like it's a very forced way of saying that you're winning, which means that you're in a framework of winning over someone or something, right? But if it's benefits, it's about the outcome more than sort of a quantifiable number. So it's not about the number of clicks. I'm just using examples like it's not about screen time. It's really over a longer trajectory, a longer time horizon. Is that really paying off in making someone feeling better about themselves, understanding themselves better? And obviously also, I love that you also brought up resiliency. And that's what Evermore is about. Like, how can we start to actually provide the learnings of both on human side and machine side and create sort of like this framework of true wisdom that young people can start to learn. And these are transferable life skills they need, right? It's like, why are we not teaching kids psychology sooner? And is there also an opportunity, a space for Evermore to kind of become that space? I feel like the answer is yes, because we're getting them to start unpacking and process their thoughts in a very educated way.
I love it. Well, again, the move to whole social emotional learning in schools, right, will be a big headwind into this work that you're doing. So I think, again, it's pretty extraordinary to see how that is just evolved in very quick time to me. Like that was not how my children were exposed, and my kid's only 17, right? And you're seeing so much of it now in schools around the country. So the last question I will ask you then, what have you learned about yourself doing all this?
I realized that there's going to be a time, and it came last year, when I knew very, very saliently that I just cannot not do something anymore, right? I know I keep on saying that, and it's really weird because it's like a double, triple negative. I cannot not do something.
Right, right, right.
I don't take credit for it. That's from like Cloud Alice or something like that. But it's where I do feel like at one point you realize that you have to do something not just to make a living, but you have to do something that opens yourself up to other other confluence of energies that kind of think like you, right? And then that's why I love what you have created here, because it's really an incubation space for a lot of great minds to come together and start talking about things that really matter. Um, it I've learned that at one point, if I start to, and this is probably a tip, and sometimes we don't think about it, but I literally become more of a downer. And I think I was becoming more of a downer last year. I was not a fun person to hang out with, even though I'm naturally like an upper and I'm just very enthusiastic about things. Your energy changes when you're kind of almost experiencing a block, right? And I think naturally I am a builder. If I have an idea, I can't scribble on a pad forever. I need to make it. So that's what I've learned in the past year. Being on this like startup journey is I have, if I have an idea, I need to build. I need to kind of potentiate the idea by working with others, not in a vacuum, and to make sure that there's always learning. And this whole like lifetime learner thing that resonates with me, just as the growth mindset, like all of these trigger words for me resonate because I realize that ideas, a thought is just a mere, it's just a thought is just a mere thought until you do something about it.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Same thing as
I used the term, I wrote a note the other day to somebody. I said, curiosity in motion, right? This idea about putting curiosity in motion.
yes,
What you demonstrate.
perfect.
So, because again, a lot of us, I mean, again, I've had like, I actually literally put them on Post-it notes once. I was like, what are all these things I think that should exist on the planet? And I thought there maybe be 12, and I just wanted to get them out of my head. And there were 41. I'm like, holy crap, there's like 41 things. Like, by the way, that there should be a restaurant recommendation like Pandora. Like, you'd be like, that restaurant, you should love this restaurant, right? In different cities around the world. I'm like, how does that not exist? But it was just, I can think about these ideas all day long. I mean, small and large, but really putting them into action is, takes work. And even around Femme Futurists Society, like we love what we're doing. Emma and I are really excited about what the experience we get to have, but it doesn't have a business model around it. We haven't figured out, right now it's just, it's a philanthropy that's run just because we think it's cool to go do, but we haven't really thought through it. So there's a lot of complex decisions that go into building something, from the beginning, and then making it sustainable.
Right.
So I applaud you for having both the drive and the courage and the pluck to stick with us. I go back to Amelia Earhart, right? The hardest decision is the decision to act, and the rest is tenacity, but tenacity really is a big part of the formula. So I'm excited to continue to witness your progress.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Going back to exactly what you just said before, it's again, sometimes at the time we most needed, I'm hoping that we can always keep this in mind, is sometimes you just don't know. It could be a call, it could be a text, hopefully a call, speaking from somebody who's building a voice technology, because there's a lot of tone and energy infused in your voice. But you don't ever forget that sometimes somebody really needed that moment of buoyancy, and you could be that person to give it to them. And really that's kind of like the summation of a whole lifetime, right? Somebody either picks A versus B, depending on how they felt that day, that week, that month, or that entire year. Like it's these micro moments that really count. So yes, the ability to act for the benefit of another person, we kind of have to.
Well, and that literally sums up what we're trying to do with the series, right? Is really what we're trying to do with these conversations. It just like make it visible that there's this work that's being created on the planet by really passionate, powerful, brilliant women that really do want to have, a safer, more inclusive, fun world ahead. And I think it's cool for people to see that, because I think that we all sort of lose our belief in that and our faith in that sometimes. And so it's really, I just get a constant reinforcement every week around it. I hope other people do as well, because I think it's really, really cool to see what's being built and who's building it. Like, I just think it's fascinating. So thank you, Miss Sting. You're in our web and in our world forever now. And as I was just, we've talked about this in other ways, but I really I hope in the post-COVID world there will be a way in which we can gather us together in spaces, because I think part of it is weaving what you're doing with work that somebody else is doing. It's really fascinating to kind of see how so many, not just the Femme Futurists, but certainly people in the world, but particularly Femme Futurists, are doing work that is not collaborative is not the word, complementary.
Right. Right.
Emma and I talk about this idea of cultural acupuncture, right? You're doing your thing over here, and Sahara's doing her thing in South Africa, and my friend Shaku's doing her thing here in Austin, and somebody else is doing their thing there with youth. And at some point, all that radiates to the solution and to the better space that we want to be in. So
I love that analogy.
Yeah, it really works. It really does work. And it also means that we don't all have to handle all of the weight. I'm just doing my bit here, right? And if it radiates and you're doing your bit there and it radiates, it will create the change. Or will create the opportunity, the fertile ground that we need for the next level of whatever needs to grow into consciousness. And so, I appreciate that you took the leap to go do this. That is a big leap to go, jump into this world and do it. And we are championing you.
Thank you. And thank you for absorbing me into this beautiful ecosystem that you have created. You have completely defaulted to action, like you were saying, not figuring out, slowly figuring out sustainability, but you have gone ahead and started talking to these really amazing minds, getting people to talk about their ideas. We forget sometimes. We forget. Some of us forget because we're all behind the screens these days. The power of the power of spoken words, right? And you're doing it also in the voice format, but also video, which is a double whammer. It's all kinds of happiness and coalescing what a conversation and dialogue needs to be, especially nowadays. It's so special, and thanks for having me.
Well, again, you are here forever. So thank you. And here's Emma back. Yay.
Hi, Emma. You're muted.
You're mute. We can only see you. Hey, you're on mute. Em. We can't hear you.
Oh my God. I'm just saying, us women are going to save the world. I swear to God. Wow, Ivy. I did download your beta version and I took the test. And as I was reading through it, I just thought, I so want my 11-year-olds to get on this platform. Even now, before they start heading into this world of social media, and in particular with the awareness that Nancy and I have anyway of the detrimental effects of social platforms, but that all got riled up again recently when we watched The Social Dilemma. And so, I just feel very cognizant of the way that they're going to develop. And, it can either be healthy or it can be unhealthy, and I just want to, as a parent, steer them towards the healthiest path that I can. So I just think it's really extraordinary that you even had the idea or the thought to create this, but that you actually manifested it in the world. I just think is such an incredible tool for good, and I just really celebrate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And before you put yourself off mute, I know you were hugging us, so I'm here to hug back.
Again, we're super lucky because Em and I decided to break that bubble on week 2 of this whole thing. And we often, a couple times a week, we work in the same space together. We walk every Saturday together. We spend an enormous amount of time together. We are fused. And it's really given us a tremendous lift because we don't feel like we're in this work alone, right? Or in this year alone. And so, yes, we love to hug as many as we can because we feel very fortunate to get this ride that we get to ride. It's a really, it's an amazing space we get to be in, Ivy. It's really beautiful work. So again, as I say, this will continue to grow. The society is the people who are listening, but it's also the people who are contributing, and we will figure out how to connect and engage each other more because we're here anytime. Many of these women and I have become really good friends now, and we just check in with each other whenever we want to just say hi or need something. So I'm here anyway, and so is Em.
Right.
And connecting dots with everybody. We've been talking a lot about how we can connect you all with one another.
I know, we're trying to sort that out.
Before, stage and time, I really hope that this can become some sort of gathering in which we can all come together. That's, you know, in a way that's not virtual, to just love and support one another. And
Yeah. Well, the physical world is there to waiting for us when we're ready as a collective. You know, but what you have built here is you have already an ecosystem. And
well, it'll be an ecosystem when I think that you guys connect with one another. Right now, we're the portal, right? So all we're doing is creating these conversations and designed to have them be conversational, and they kind of meander on purpose to be able to share with the world. But I do think having it be somehow more interactive or engaging and make it be more of a society is the goal. And again, you know, I know what I'm good at and I know what I'm not great at. And so this part I'm really good at, the other part I'm a little less great at. So we're bringing in some hopefully, you know, the right people will come along that will help us build this. And that's why, again, I'm so fascinated by the intentional community side of it, because I do think that we want to be, there is a natural curation and sort of, I call it the universal algorithm that somehow pulls us to each other. But the mechanisms that create those conversations or make space for them, I think is a really important part of how it works. So
yeah, I can tell that kind of is something that you really connect with when you brought it up. And also, obviously, thank you, ladies, for a lot of times people, we're going so fast these days. People don't do their homework. They don't read up on the person they're about to speak to. And there's just like not a lot of sincerity behind a conversation. So I just want to mention, and also it's a heartfelt thing, like, thank you for just doing everything right as humans.
well, I'm going to remind my daughter of that in the moments when I'm not doing something right. So I would say, but
yeah.
I
Yeah, you guys are great moms. Like I can only hope that when I become a mom one day, I will be just half as that. That would be good.
Yeah, you will, because
I
you're
know. Nancy's daughter thinks she's her best friend and is amazing. I'm not sure my 11-year-olds have quite the same opinion of me at this moment.
Well,
homeschooling.
I've got, you know, a 20-year-old and a 23-year-old, and my 23-year-old is definitely going through his level of anxiety right now about going and becoming an adult, right? Exactly what he's leaving grad school and is his first real job, and he's got one lined up. He doesn't have to worry about finding it, like, and it's sort of in some ways his dream job. But the idea of leaving the freedom of being a student to being, you know, a cog in the industrial military complex is something that's kind of really freaking him out. And so, you know, even when you do it all, quote unquote, as right as you can, there's still, you know, the alchemy of the human inside the alchemy of the system, and they're working their way through it. And so more tools like this that help them know themselves and give them confidence in themselves is the key, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one last thing I want to say is, like, I do feel like there's too much ideologies floating out there. And a lot of times when a person's not sure about themselves, they tend to want to gravitate towards, they want to be in the in-group, right? It's completely understandable. But then that inherently is dangerous, because then you don't really know who you are yet before you start calling yourself X, Y, and Z.
100%. And again, do you know who you are in the Enneagram? I was thinking about that during the conversation. Do you know what personality?
I shift between, I'm always shifting lanes. I'm usually a magician or a sage.
But in the Enneagram, it's a different, because you use a certain archetype system in terms of your coding of it. But do you have the Enneagram one, which is like reformer, an individualist, and loyalist, enthusiast?
I haven't done that one.
Oh, the Enneagram would be really, really interesting, because it's much more dynamic, and it talks about where you are under stress versus where it is when you're feeling really, you know, at optimal level. And so what I like is that it gives you more of this dynamic energy. But there's something that you just said that for some reason made me think of it, because I think because I, you know, primarily identify as a challenger and a provocateur, right, and a protector, and then there's another part of me that's an enthusiast. And so because I already know that about me, it makes it so that I don't feel like I have to be in the in-group all the time, right? So my job is to sort of be the challenger and to be the provocateur. And so I do think that's where that level of awareness is really helpful, because it makes us not feel like we all have to identify like everybody else. And this is where our strengths are, or our natural tendencies are that are helpful, and here's where our natural tendencies are that might get in our way. And it's just really useful to have those as guides. And what I love again about the Enneagram, and I do encourage you to explore it, because it's dynamic. It's not like all these other things that say you are this. It just says, again, when you're feeling confident, you gravitate this way, and when you're feeling less or you're under stress, or you're feeling not so much insecure, but you're just feeling stress, you adopt these as coping mechanisms, which is really, really useful to see. Because I think we always take ourselves as a snapshot of our worst selves, as opposed to our potentially most potent selves. And I think having that as a more fluid system is really good. So.
I like that word, fluid. So Emma, you took the archetype quiz. That's part of the onboarding experience of the app. And the whole idea here, again, going back to what we're saying, like, just give them a universal narrative. It's a storyline. It's good to think that you're a magician or a sage or something. And then also know that you're fluid. So you're always changing.
That part is really key, because I was magician on your archetype thing. And then I knew on your demo, you give an example also of seeker and the other one. And I'm like, but I put myself in all of those things, right? And
hey, we are. You guys will like this. If you don't remember, I'll remind you, but it's The Hero Within by Carol Pearson. So she's a psychologist, but she basically took Carl Jung's archetypal psychology to such an accessible, approachable way that basically just breaks it down for you and be like, guess what, Ivy, you were brought up in a family of warriors and magicians. No wonder you're more like this, you know?
Right. Oh, I love that. That's cool. That's good.
Yeah. So I feel like, again, it's like self-discoveries first before all the labels that the world's throwing at us.
I know. I'm with you. And then they all have gifts. I mean, I think that's really the key, is that every one of these archetypes has gifts and things to contribute that are different than other people's. That's, again, back to the cultural acupuncture thing. So we can do
remember that term.
All right, I got to go get ready for a call with the Alabama Manufacturers Association, which is so much like Oxy than this. So, thank you, my loves. We'll stay in touch, Ivy. We'll let you know. Emma will do a whole thing. I think it'll probably come out in about 2 weeks.
Okay.
3 weeks, because we got a little backlog now. And she'll do a whole little social media thingy and let you know when it's out, and we'll give you lots of love. And, we're just hoping to just share the word. We want people to watch more of these. So
thank you.